Donnell returned from Banneker with a calmer presence than before, but that calm did not mean he had escaped the shadow of his family. Fairmont Crest had never been a place that allowed anyone to truly start over. And the fact that he came home just as the entire community was preparing for the gala only made everything far more dangerous than it appeared on the surface. Vanessa understood that better than anyone. She understood every probing glance in this community, understood how an evening that looked like nothing more than a social event could turn into a private trial where reputations were dissected. The past was pulled out and sharpened into a weapon, and children were turned into chess pieces so adults could get what they wanted. That was why, when Vanessa asked Donnell for a favor, it was not simply a mother needing help from her son. It was a woman who had lived too long inside a vortex of power, trying to keep the board stable at any cost. Even if it meant pushing her own son into a role she knew very well would make him uncomfortable. Vanessa's request sounded perfectly reasonable at first, even affectionate. Samantha was anxious about the upcoming gala, and Donnell had experience in formal social settings like this, so having him escort her seemed like the cleanest solution. No need for awkward introductions, no need to bring in an outsider who might make everything more uncomfortable, no need to risk a small mishap turning into the talk of all Fairmont Crest. Vanessa framed it as a safe choice, a kind favor, a proper family gesture toward a young woman who needed protection from social pressure. But beneath that gentle surface was a very sharp calculation. Vanessa did not just want Samantha to have someone beside her. She wanted that person to be Donnell, because if Donnell was with Samantha, Vanessa could control the rhythm of the evening, control who approached whom, who said what, and most importantly, stop another group of adults from using the gala to stage a public humiliation. She chose her son not only because she trusted him, but because she knew he would have a hard time refusing when the request was wrapped in the emotions mothers like her were so skilled at using. Duty, guilt, and the feeling that if he said no, it would not only hurt Samantha, but make Vanessa herself look like a woman who could not keep order in her own house. Donnell felt that from the very first moment. He was no longer the teenage boy who nodded just to avoid an argument. His time in Banneker had taught him to see the hidden wiring in adult relationships, especially the way decisions made in the name of protection were often really about preserving control. His irritation did not explode into a confrontation because he knew his mother well enough to understand that Vanessa did not respond well to direct refusal, especially when she was already stretched out with tension before the gala. But that restraint only made his anger heavier. He felt himself being pulled back into the old role, the good son who knew where to stand, when to appear, what to do so his mother would not lose face. Another part of him felt insulted, because Vanessa spoke as if he were just carrying out a short-term task. While he understood perfectly well that accompanying Samantha that night would immediately place him at the center of a game he was not even sure he wanted to play. Every step he took would be watched, every look he gave Samantha would be interpreted. Every act of protection or silence would become a political message in the eyes of adults always hungry to read new alliances in the behavior of their children. What unsettled Donnell most was that he could not say with complete confidence that he was agreeing only because of his mother. Even before this, in those accidental encounters, he had noticed Samantha in the quietest way possible, not enough to call it feeling, but enough to create an attention he did not want anyone to see. Samantha was not like many people in Fairmont Crest. She carried the pressure of being a senator's daughter, yet sometimes seemed like she needed nothing more than a quiet space to be herself. There was a strength in her that had been forged too early, and a fracture in her spirit she always covered with composure. Donnell had seen it in the way she looked around, always more alert than necessary, as if she had already learned that the moment she relaxed, someone would step in and take over her story. That similarity made him want to move closer and pull away at the same time. He understood what it felt like to be watched as a symbol instead of a person. He understood the fear of having family history dragged into a room full of polished smiles. And he understood, more than anything, that if he let himself care about Samantha even a little more, he would no longer be standing outside at all. At Orphe Jean, the atmosphere had already begun to shift before gala night even arrived. The moment Donnell appeared beside Samantha, the fragile social balance among the girls began to crack. Chessie Belleclaire reacted almost immediately, not with a crude outburst, but with the kind of deliberate coldness that came from someone who understood exactly how many eyes were on her. Her discomfort was not simply jealousy because Samantha had a date. It was the feeling of losing control on a stage she had always assumed belonged to her. Chessie was used to directing the room, used to being the center, used to her comments determining who was fashionable, who got pushed to the edge, who deserved attention, and who should be ignored. Donnell's presence at Samantha's side made Chessie realize there was now a variable she had not arranged and that threatened the image of power she had built among her friends. Chessie's anger sharpened further because Donnell was not exactly a stranger to her. They may never have had anything clearly defined between them, but there had been enough lingering glances, enough half-teasing signals, enough moments when Chessie believed that if she wanted to, she could pull him into her orbit. Donnell had never confirmed that. But his lack of a firm rejection in the past had accidentally allowed Chessie to nurture the illusion that he was only keeping his distance because the timing was wrong. Now, seeing him appear publicly with Samantha, all those vague assumptions turned back and struck her pride. In Chessie's eyes, this was no longer a social rivalry between two girls. It had become a rejection. Donnell had not only failed to choose her, he had chosen to stand beside the person she considered a rival. And in Fairmont Crest, being rejected under the gaze of the community was a dangerous wound, because it quickly became a story other people told for you. Samantha felt that pressure immediately, even as she tried to keep her expression calm. Her fear of the gala had never been just about the dress or the opening dance. What kept her awake was the image of walking into a room where every look had an agenda, where her father's name arrived before she did, and where any mistake could be upgraded into scandal. Donnell agreeing to escort her was both a relief and a new source of tension. Part of her felt steadier because she would have someone beside her who was composed enough to keep her from feeling alone, but another part feared his presence might make things worse. Because Donnell carried his own family history, the same kind of history Fairmont Crest never stopped talking about. She understood exactly how this community worked. People did not wait for the truth. They waited for an image dramatic enough to assign as the truth. And the image of a senator's daughter entering the gala with Vanessa's son was far too perfect for cruel imaginations to resist. Vanessa saw all of those undercurrents and tightened her plan even more. She was not naive enough to believe that Donnell standing next to Samantha would make everything smooth. On the contrary, she was certain there would be drama, and precisely because she was certain, she wanted to control the size of the explosion. What no one said out loud but everyone could feel was that this year's gala had gone far beyond an ordinary social event. Tensions between powerful families, reputational calculations, and quiet contests for status were all converging into one evening. Samantha was entering as a senator's daughter, which meant she represented not only herself but also a kind of political power many adults both needed and resented. Vanessa did not want Samantha publicly broken by that pressure because the fallout would spiral into consequences she did not want, but she also did not want anyone to think she was weak. Donnell was the move that let her send a message. Her side was still proactive, still capable of arranging the room, still in control of the entrance and exit points of scandal. That very motive was what made Vanessa and Donnell clash in silence throughout the preparations. He noticed how excessively she cared about every detail: the arrival time, the route through the room, who to avoid, who to greet, who only needed a polite nod. The more he listened, the more it felt as though he was being trained for an operation rather than escorting a girl to a gala. His irritation grew into anger, but he stayed quiet because he could see another layer in Vanessa to the panic she was trying to hide. Vanessa was not only afraid the evening would be ruined. She was afraid of losing her ability to direct things in the very community that had swallowed so many vulnerable people. She was afraid old family wounds would be dug up just when she had rebuilt a respectable image. She was afraid Donnell, with his youth and his newly hardened sense of self, would react on instinct before understanding how one small mistake could cost them years. That fear did not soften Vanessa. It made her even more controlling, and that control only made Donnell want to resist her more. Mother and son were bound by the same fear, but chose opposite ways of facing it. She wanted to tighten her grip. He wanted to break free, and that contradiction became the true spark of the story. Meanwhile, Chessie did not stop at surface-level sarcasm. With her pride stemmed so deeply, she began thinking like someone defending territory. What made her dangerous was not impulsiveness, but her ability to keep an elegant exterior while quietly pushing other people into situations where they would lose control. She knew exactly where Samantha was vulnerable. Samantha did not fear direct attacks as much as being forced to explain herself in front of a crowd. Forced to choose between silence to preserve dignity or reacting to defend herself and looking panicked for doing so. Chessie began dropping small rumors, vague enough that no one could accuse her directly, but poisonous enough to make the air turn heavy, that Samantha having Donnell with her was not random. That it might be an arrangement by the adults, that old social debts were being settled right there on the dance floor. Those insinuations needed no proof to work, because in Fairmont Crest, the most irresistible thing was always an unconfirmed secret. The closer gala hour came, the more Donnell realized he was truly being dragged into the power game he had once hoped to avoid. He could see clearly now that Samantha was no longer just a girl who needed an escort. She was standing in the middle of invisible crossfire, and his being beside her automatically made him part of both the defense and the attack. That forced him to confront the choice he had wanted to postpone. If Chessie or anyone else openly pressured Samantha, what would he do? Staying silent would mean short-term safety for himself and for Vanessa, because no one could accuse him of creating trouble. But staying silent would also mean letting Samantha take the blows alone, a kind of subtle betrayal he knew he would not be able to forgive in himself. On the other hand, if he stood up for her, he would be pulled straight into the storm, and everything his mother feared the family history being dug up and weaponized could really happen. That internal struggle made Donnell angrier with himself than with anyone else, because for the first time he had to admit he could no longer pretend that this was just a polite obligation. Samantha was cornered in a similar way, except her anger turned inward before it turned outward. She hated feeling like she needed someone beside her just to avoid being attacked. She hated that one evening was enough to make her prepare herself like she was going into battle. More than that, she hated realizing that she truly wanted Donnell there not only for safety, but because he made her feel seen as a person, not as an accessory to a powerful family. That was why every cutting remark from Chessie struck a deeper layer. It was not only insulting, it touched the fear that people might be right in the cruelest way, that she and Donnell were only figures placed into a picture adults had already drawn. That the fragile feelings she did not dare name were just an accident destined to be crushed by the calculations around them. That feeling changed her. She was no longer just a girl anxious about a gala. She began to harden. Not with loud anger, but with a stillness in her eyes, a determination not to let anyone else define her night. The gala finally arrived like a stage polished carefully to hide the rot underneath. The lights, the music, the perfect gowns, and the polite smiles only made the tension more visible. When Donnell and Samantha appeared together, the effect spread almost immediately. Heads turned, conversations faltered for half a second. The looks exchanged between adults and teenagers made it clear that everyone understood this was no longer a small detail. Vanessa stood at just enough distance to observe, wearing the calm expression of a proud mother while internally measuring every beat and every risk. She saw Chessie smiling at her friends a little too long, saw people who never cared about Samantha suddenly stepping forward to offer congratulations, saw the storm gathering before it broke. And when it finally broke, it did not come as one explosive scandal. It came as a string of calculated collisions. Chessie did not choose to attack Samantha directly in front of the entire room, because that would have been too crude and too easy to turn against her. Instead, she inserted herself into key moments, the exact seconds Samantha most needed to stay composed. Delivering comments sharp enough to make tempers rise but slippery enough to be hard to challenge. She created the impression that Samantha was being managed, not respected, that Donnell was there out of duty to his mother more than because he truly wanted to be beside her. That the whole thing was nothing but a carefully staged adult arrangement. Each remark was like a thin blade, not drawing blood at once, but slowly suffocating Samantha. Donnell saw it clearly, and that was the moment something in him snapped. He understood that if he kept silent just to avoid trouble, he would be standing there watching Samantha get crushed by the exact kind of cruelty he had always despised in Fairmont Crest. Donnell's decision to stand with Samantha did not come like some romantic heroic gesture. It came like an act of anger at being turned into a tool by his mother. Anger that Chessie assumed he would step back to preserve appearances. Anger that this entire community operated on the assumption that young people would obediently accept whatever role had been assigned to them. When he publicly made his choice clear, the atmosphere changed at once. It did not need a loud scene to become a shock. The message was obvious. Donnell was no longer just Vanessa's son standing there to complete a task, and Samantha was no longer a girl who could be forced into a corner with a few cold remarks. In that instant, Chessie truly lost her composure on the inside because she realized she no longer controlled the story. What she thought was a social game had turned into a symbolic defeat right in front of the very people she most wanted to impress. But Fairmont Crest never allows a personal choice to remain private. The moment Donnell and Samantha showed a real bond, the adults immediately read it as an alliance. To them, the opening dance was no longer just a dance. It was a signal of who was moving closer to whom, who needed a cleaner image from whom, who was using their children to patch cracks in old power relationships. Vanessa felt that wave of interpretation at once, and she was split between relief and dread. Relief because Donnell had not let Samantha be isolated. Dread because everything was now moving beyond her original zone of control. She had wanted a stable evening, but what her son had done had created a new axis in the room one other people would try to exploit after tonight. The contradiction tore her in two. Part of her was proud that Donnell had made a choice and was willing to bear the consequences. The other part was furious that he had acted unfeeling at the exact moment she needed discipline. As for Samantha, the gala did not end in clean relief, but in a bitter kind of clarity. She did not collapse the way many people expected, but she also no longer had the innocence to believe confidence alone could carry her through this kind of quiet attack. She could see clearly now that she had crossed a line. Before, she could still tell herself she was only trying to live quietly in the shadow of her family. After tonight, she understood she had become a real player on the Fairmont Crest board, whether she wanted that or not. Standing beside Donnell gave her strength, but it also made her a larger target. That made her angry not at Donnell, but at the entire system that turned every genuine feeling into material for schemes. Even so, that anger gave her something she had never had so clearly before, the will to choose for herself. So the gala did not end with simple applause, and it did not need a loud public scandal to become one. The real scandal was that the old boundaries had shifted. Vanessa realized she could not keep controlling Donnell through guilt forever, because he had begun making choices according to his own conscience and his own feelings. Donnell realized he could not stay outside Fairmont Crest's wars once the people he cared about were being turned into targets. Samantha realized her vulnerability was not a weakness to hide, but part of what made her more dangerous in the eyes of those who wanted control. And Chessie, for the first time, had to taste what it meant for a carefully designed plan to fail with a pride like hers. Losing the upper hand in front of a crowd was a debt she would try to repay with a much larger blow. After that night, the polite smiles in Fairmont Crest would remain exactly the same, but underneath them a far more vicious silent battle would be underway. The relationship between Donnell and Samantha, whether they named it or not, had already become a flashpoint for speculation, jealousy, and new calculations. Vanessa would be forced to choose between continuing to control everything or learning to trust her son in a way that meant loosening her grip. Chessie would have to decide whether she only wanted her dignity back or whether she truly meant to destroy Samantha with a plan that could shake the entire community. And Donnell and Samantha, the people who had supposedly only walked into a gala now, stood before a much harder decision: step back and protect themselves, or take one more step into the new alliance forming between them and accept that, from now on, every feeling they had for each other could become fuel for a much larger war. In Fairmont Crest, no one is allowed to love, rage, or protect each other without calculation, and that is what makes the tragedy ahead so frightening.